Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more amazing HFY stories. Hit the bell icon to get notified about our latest uploads. The red planet loomed large on the view screen, its surface marked by the scars of countless battles. Captain Elias Kane stood at the helm of the Vanguard, his flagship, watching as the small human colony below fought for survival. The Xylorii, a race of towering insectoid creatures with chitinous exoskeletons and gleaming mandibles, had come without warning. Their ships, sleek and deadly, circled the colony's orbit like vultures, preparing for the kill. Kane's fingers tightened around the console. His voice, calm and steady, resonated through the comms, directing his crew to hold their positions. "All hands prepare for impact," he ordered. He'd been in plenty of battles before, but this was different. This was a fight for survival, and the humans had only one chance to survive. "Captain, we're getting incoming fire," shouted Lieutenant Maya Pierce, his tactical officer. Her voice was strained, her eyes wide with the gravity of their situation. Kane turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "Return fire. Full power to the main cannons." The Vanguard shook under the barrage of enemy fire. Kane could hear the groaning of the hull as the ship buckled under the assault. He clenched his jaw but said nothing. His crew was used to pressure, and they executed his orders with precision. The massive cannons of the Vanguard opened fire, releasing bolts of plasma into the void, striking the enemy ships with deadly accuracy. But the Xylorii ships were formidable, their advanced armor resisting even the heaviest blows. On the planet's surface, the humans fought desperately to hold their ground. Colonists scrambled to defend their homes, using every weapon at their disposal to fend off the invaders. But the Xylorii warriors were relentless. Their tall, armored forms moved through the colony with deadly precision, cutting down any resistance in their path. Each strike from their razor-sharp claws sent shockwaves through the air, the sound echoing with terrifying finality. Kane's comms crackled. "Captain, they've breached the outer perimeter. We can't hold them off much longer." The voice belonged to Sergeant Hall, one of the ground commanders. Kane's gaze sharpened. He knew what that meant. The colony's defenses were failing, and if they couldn't push the Xylorii back, the humans would be doomed. He made a snap decision. "Deploy the drop pods. I'll lead the charge." The lieutenant glanced at him, startled. "Sir, you're not seriously?" "I am," Kane said, cutting her off. "We're not going to let them take this place without a fight. Get us in close to the colony." A brief silence followed, then Maya nodded, complying with his order. The Vanguard descended, its drop pods firing from the hull in rapid succession, landing on the surface amidst the chaos. Kane stepped out of his pod, his boots hitting the dirt with a thud. Around him, soldiers and civilians were already engaging the enemy. The air was thick with the smell of smoke, the sharp clang of weapons, and the cries of the wounded. But through it all, Kane's focus never wavered. He moved with purpose, cutting down a few of the alien invaders with his plasma rifle before pushing forward. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath him, and he heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps. Turning sharply, Kane's eyes locked onto the figure emerging from the smoke, Zorith, the leader of the Xylorii assault. He was everything the legends had promised, a massive, armored behemoth standing over 10 feet tall, his jagged claws glinting under the sun. His chitinous skin was black as midnight, and his eyes burned with a ferocious hunger for blood. Kane's heart pounded in his chest, but he didn't flinch. This was the moment. He knew that standing before Zorith meant certain death for most, but something about this warlord's eyes told him that this battle wouldn't be as straightforward as it seemed. Zorith stopped in his tracks, his mandibles clicking in amusement. "You are the human who leads them? The one who dares to fight us?" Kane didn't respond immediately. Instead, he leveled his weapon and took a step forward, his voice calm but unwavering. "I'm the one who's going to send you packing." Zorith's laughter echoed in the air, a sound both chilling and darkly triumphant. "Bold words, little human. But you will fall like the rest. All humans do." Kane stood firm, his knuckles tight on his rifle. "Not today." Zorith's amusement faded as he sized up Captain Elias Kane, his dark, compound eyes narrowing. For the first time since landing on this insignificant planet, the Xylorii warlord felt a flicker of something he didn't recognize: curiosity. The human before him was no trembling, desperate soldier. He stood tall, eyes locked on Zorith without a hint of fear. The warlord's mandibles clicked again, this time in a more contemplative rhythm. "You do not understand the fate awaiting you," Zorith growled, his voice deep and resonant. "You and your people are nothing but prey. Your planet will burn and I will feast on your bones." Cain took a step closer, his pulse steady despite the overwhelming size and presence of his adversary. "You're wrong," he said, his tone cold yet filled with defiance. "We don't fall easily." The silence between them stretched as both warriors sized each other up. Then, to Cain's surprise, Zorith raised one of his massive claws, gesturing to the burning city behind him, where the human defenders fought with desperate ferocity. "I see," Zorith rumbled, a twisted gleam appearing in his eyes. "Your spirit. It is what makes you different. Stronger than the others." His mandibles clicked thoughtfully. "You are no ordinary human." Cain's muscles tensed, ready for a sudden attack. But instead, Zorith slowly withdrew from him, taking several long strides back, his gaze shifting to the sky above. Cain's mind raced. What was this alien warlord playing at? "I offer you a challenge, human," Zorith declared. His voice was rich with authority, and even the nearby Xylorii warriors paused to listen. "A duel one-on-one. If you are truly as strong as your kind believes, then face me in combat and prove your worth." The proposition hung in the air, and the tension between the two warriors was palpable. Cain's heart skipped a beat. A duel? He had heard of Zorith's legendary brutality, his skill in battle was renowned across the galaxy, and no one had ever bested him. The idea of accepting such a challenge seemed foolish, reckless. But then Cain remembered his people, his colony, and the helpless civilians caught in the crossfire. "No weapons," Zorith continued, his voice steady but commanding. "Hand to hand. If you win, your people will be spared. If you lose, your colony falls, and I shall wipe you from the face of this planet." The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Cain considered his options, the weight of his decision pressing on him. His training, his years of experience flashed through his mind. He wasn't the strongest, but he was quick and resourceful. A human's greatest strength lay not in their size or raw power, but in their adaptability and the ability to think in the heat of battle. Zorith's challenge was a dangerous gamble, but one he couldn't ignore. Cain knew that if he refused, the Xylorii would destroy the colony without hesitation. But if he accepted, he had a chance, slim though it might be, to save his people. "I accept," Cain said, his voice unwavering. The words felt heavy, like an anchor dragging him toward an uncertain fate. Zorith's laugh rumbled like distant thunder. "Very well, human. Your courage impresses me even if it is misguided. Prepare yourself." Cain felt a sharp pang of anxiety, but he forced it down. He would not allow himself to be distracted by fear. As he readied himself, the surrounding Xylorii warriors cleared a space, forming a ring around them. Cain was keenly aware of their eyes on him, their cold alien stares full of anticipation. This wasn't just a duel. It was a spectacle. His life, or death, would be watched by the entire Xylorii war machine. The moment Cain stepped into the arena, he felt the weight of the challenge fully settle on his shoulders. Zorith stood before him, towering, his massive rippling muscles rippling beneath his armor. His black exoskeleton gleamed in the harsh light of the planet's twin suns, and his claws seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy. Cain's hand instinctively reached for the blade at his side, but he remembered the conditions of the duel. No weapons. Cain squared his shoulders and took a deep breath. This wasn't just about winning. It was about survival, about showing the Xylorii that humanity was not to be underestimated. Zorith took a slow step forward, his feet thudding against the ground like the rumble of an earthquake. "You are brave, human. I will give you that. But bravery alone will not save you." Cain didn't respond. His eyes never left Zorith as the warlord's massive claws raised, preparing for the first strike. Cain knew he had to move fast. The first few moments of the fight would decide everything. He needed to make the warlord feel his presence, force him to underestimate the human warrior in front of him. With a sudden surge of movement, Cain launched himself toward Zorith, aiming to strike at his opponent's exposed chest. The Xylorii warlord was fast, much faster than Cain had expected. His claw shot out like a blur, swatting Cain aside with a force that sent the human reeling. The impact sent a shock of pain through Cain's side, but he quickly regained his balance, rolling back onto his feet. The Xylorii warrior growled in satisfaction, sensing that Cain was no ordinary prey. He moved in for another strike, his massive claw aimed directly for Cain's head. But Cain wasn't there. Instead, he darted to the side, using his speed and agility to his advantage. Zorith's blow hit nothing but air, and before the warlord could react, Cain slammed a punch into his side. The impact was enough to make Zorith stagger back, his mandibles clicking in surprise. Cain's heart raced, but he kept his focus. This was his chance. "You're quick," Zorth acknowledged, his voice almost admiring. But it will take more than speed to defeat me. Cain didn't answer. He was already on the move again, darting forward and delivering a series of rapid strikes to the warlord's midsection. His punches landed with a sickening thud, but they barely seemed to faze Zorth, who retaliated with a vicious swipe of his claws. Cain ducked just in time, but the strike grazed his shoulder, leaving a deep gash. Blood dripped down his arm, but he gritted his teeth and kept moving. Every strike counted, and he couldn't afford to slow down now. His mind raced, searching for the weakness in Zorth's defenses. Zorth had underestimated him, and now Cain had to make that mistake cost him. The ground beneath Cain's boots seemed to tremble as the warlord's heavy steps shook the earth. His chest heaved with controlled breaths, the adrenaline surging through his veins as the fight intensified. Despite the searing pain in his shoulder, Cain's focus never wavered. The cut was deep and blood stained his uniform, but he didn't have time to dwell on it. Every second counted. Zorth, the mighty warlord who had struck terror across the galaxy, had now become a towering challenge, but one that Cain was determined to face head-on. The Xylorii warrior's claw glinted in the light of the twin suns, and his eyes narrowed as he assessed his human opponent. "You surprise me, human," Zorth rumbled, his voice low and thunderous. His mandibles clicked in amusement, but his tone was edged with a hint of irritation. "Most of your kind run and hide when faced with death. But you," he stopped, his deep voice shifting to a dangerous purr. "You refuse to bend?" Cain didn't reply. Words weren't needed. His actions spoke louder than anything he could say. As Zorth lunged forward again, Cain dove to the side, narrowly avoiding the warlord's crushing blow. The massive claw missed by mere inches, carving deep gouges into the earth. Dust and debris flew into the air, momentarily obscuring Cain's vision, but he kept his eyes locked on the warlord's every movement. Zorth's size was overwhelming, and with each swing of his claws, the ground vibrated beneath Cain's feet. The human warrior wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for the survival of an entire colony, his people. He couldn't afford to falter. If he did, it would be the end of everything. Sweat trickled down Cain's face, but his mind remained sharp. He had always been quick, agile, and adaptable, traits that had served him well throughout his military career. He was smaller, faster, and more capable of maneuvering around the larger Zorth. The Xylorii warlord, while strong, was slower than he had anticipated, and Cain quickly realized he had an opportunity. "Come on, Zorth," Cain shouted, his voice defiant. "Is this all you've got?" Zorth snarled in response, his eyes narrowing in contempt. "You mock me, human. You think this is a game?" Cain didn't give him time to answer. Using the warlord's anger against him, Cain launched himself into the air, his body twisting and spinning as he executed a mid-air flip. He landed behind Zorth, his foot planted firmly against the warlord's back as he used the momentum to drive his elbow into the creature's exposed ribs. The impact sent a shockwave through Cain's body, but Zorth grunted in pain, his exoskeleton cracking under the force. The warlord staggered forward, momentarily stunned. Cain saw his chance and followed up with a rapid series of punches, each strike aimed at Zorth's joints, where his armor was weakest. Cain's fists connected with the Xylorii's abdomen, his blows landing with a sickening thud, but the warlord's tough exoskeleton absorbed most of the damage. Still, Cain could feel his opponent's resistance faltering with every hit. Zorth growled in fury, swinging his massive arm in an attempt to swat Cain aside. But the human was already gone, his body darting to the side, narrowly escaping the crushing blow. He wasn't just fighting for survival, he was fighting to prove something. The Xylorii might have vast physical power, but Cain had something they couldn't comprehend, the will to fight until the very end. The warlord's frustration was evident as he turned to face Cain, his mandibles clicking loudly in agitation. "You fight like an insect," Zorth spat, his voice dripping with venom. "I have crushed countless foes, and yet here you are standing before me refusing to die. You think that's going to make me back down?" Cain asked, his voice steady despite the burning pain in his shoulder. "You don't know what it means to be human. We don't quit. We don't run. We fight until the last breath." Cain's words hit the Xylorii warrior like a physical blow. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in Zorth's eyes, something Cain had never expected: respect. It was a fleeting moment, quickly masked by the warlord's unyielding arrogance, but it was enough to give Cain a glimmer of hope. The Xylorii's next attack came fast and furious, his claws swiping through the air with deadly precision. Cain barely dodged the first strike, but the second one landed with terrifying force. The claw grazed across his side, tearing through his uniform and leaving a deep gash in its wake. Blood sprayed from the wound and Cain staggered backward, his vision blurring from the pain. But he refused to fall. He sucked in a sharp breath, steadying himself. The pain was unbearable, but he had faced worse in the past. This wasn't just about him anymore, it was about everyone he had sworn to protect. The colony's survival was tied to this moment, to this battle. He couldn't afford to lose. Zoratha's roar filled the air as he charged forward, but Cain was ready. In that split second, everything clicked into place. He had studied the Xylorii warriors for years, understanding their tactics, their weaknesses. He knew that Zoratha's size was both a strength and a weakness. The warlord's brute force was powerful, but it left him open to being outmaneuvered. Cain feinted left, drawing Zoratha's attention, then pivoted sharply to the right. His fist connected with the back of Zoratha's knee joint, a vulnerable area the warlord had neglected. The impact was enough to make Zorath stagger, his balance momentarily compromised. Cain didn't wait. With a swift kick, he struck the back of Zoratha's knee again, sending the warlord crashing to the ground with a resounding thud. The earth itself seemed to shake beneath the massive creature's weight. For the first time, Zorath was on his knees, breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in rapid succession. Cain stood over him, his breath ragged and uneven, his body bruised and battered, but his resolve stronger than ever. "You're not invincible, Zorath," Cain said, his voice steady despite the chaos swirling around him. "You're just another warrior. And this human is going to beat you." Zoratha's mandibles clicked in anger, but there was something else in his eyes now, something Cain had never expected: doubt. You are no ordinary human," Zorath growled, his voice low and full of reluctant admiration. "I have underestimated you." Cain's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the warlord struggle to regain his footing. He knew this was his chance, his one shot at turning the tide in favor of humanity. But the fight wasn't over yet, and Zorath would never give up easily. Cain wasn't done. Not by a long shot. With every ounce of strength he had left, he lunged forward, his body a blur of motion. This battle was far from finished. Zoratha's massive form struggled to regain its footing. His legs trembled, his clawed hands scraping against the earth as he attempted to rise. The ground beneath him cracked as the Xylorii warlord's immense strength fought against the momentum of his fall. Cain watched, his body still aching but his mind sharp and calculating. The warlord had been knocked off balance, but this was far from over. The Xylorii were relentless, and they had an almost unnatural endurance. Cain knew he couldn't afford to let up. If he hesitated, if he allowed doubt to creep in, he would pay the price. His movements were a blur as he closed the distance between himself and the fallen warlord. He had to keep Zorath down, make this fight as one-sided as possible. He couldn't give the warlord the chance to get back on his feet and recover. Zorath snarled, his mandibles vibrating in frustration. He struck the ground with his claws, and in an explosive burst of strength, he shoved himself upward, sending a shockwave of force through the earth. The Xylorii's body was a weapon in itself, and as he rose, Cain barely managed to leap back in time to avoid the warlord's vicious strike. "You are persistent," Zorath growled, his voice laced with a mixture of respect and irritation. "I underestimated you, human. You are a worthy foe." Cain didn't answer. He couldn't afford to. He was already calculating his next move. His body was battered, and the blood from his wounds left streaks on the ground as he moved. He could feel the exhaustion creeping in, but there was no time to rest. His shoulder screamed in pain with every breath, but it was drowned out by the overwhelming drive to win. The colony depended on it. His people depended on it. The Xylorii warrior was now fully upright, his monstrous form looming over Cain once again. The warlord was slower, the cracks in his armor from Cain's previous strikes visible now, but he was far from finished. The gleam in Zoratha's eyes was dangerous, calculating. Cain knew he needed to find a weakness, something that would bring the mighty warlord down for good. "You've done well, human," Zorath said, his tone now almost contemplative, "but it is not enough. There is no victory for you here. You will fall as all others do." "Not today," Cain retorted through gritted teeth, his fists clenching at his sides. He didn't wait for the warlord to make the first move. He charged forward again, faster than before, his body moving with every ounce of speed he had left. This time Cain feinted to the left, then darted right, his movements fluid and quick. He had learned something important from their earlier exchanges. Zoratha's strength was immense, but it was his speed that was his true vulnerability. The warlord's attacks were powerful, but they lacked the precision of someone who could move with agility. Kane's tactic was clear: outsmart and outmaneuver, just as he had done with the initial strike to the back of Zoratha's knee. Zorath tried to bring his claws down on Kane, but the human had already closed the distance and ducked under the warlord's reach. With an acrobatic flip, Kane spun in midair, his fist connecting with the underside of Zoratha's jaw. The blow landed with a sickening crunch, but Kane didn't stop there. He followed through, his elbow crashing into the side of Zoratha's head, forcing the warlord's neck to snap to the side with a violent crack. Zoratha's eyes blazed with fury, and the ground trembled again as he retaliated, his massive claws reaching for Kane. This time there was no finesse in his attack, just raw power, a desperate attempt to crush the human beneath his might. Kane's instincts screamed at him to move, to get out of the way, and without thinking he leapt to the side. But this time, Zorath was quicker. His claws slashed through the air, narrowly missing Kane by mere inches, but the sheer force behind the strike sent a gust of wind that nearly knocked Kane off balance. Kane rolled away, his breath ragged. He had underestimated how close that strike had come. For a moment he considered the possibility of failure, of losing everything he had fought for. The thought of his colony, his comrades, all at the mercy of Zoratha's forces, filled him with a cold dread. But he refused to give in. He had made a promise to his people, and there was no turning back now. Zorath laughed, a low, menacing sound that seemed to resonate in Kane's bones. "You will tire, human," the warlord growled. "I will break you." Kane's chest heaved as he stood, fighting back the exhaustion threatening to overwhelm him. The pain in his shoulder was unbearable, his body feeling the toll of every strike, every dodge. His legs burned, his mind was foggy with fatigue, but still he stood tall, his eyes never leaving Zorath. "No," Kane said, his voice hoarse but firm. "Not today." With a roar of defiance, Kane charged once again, but this time with a different purpose. His movements were no longer driven by anger or desperation. They were calculated, deliberate. Kane wasn't just fighting for survival now, he was fighting for victory, and he knew what he had to do. As he moved in, Kane dodged Zoratha's wild, desperate strikes, his body instinctively finding openings. Every movement felt like a fight against gravity, but Kane pushed through, his focus razor-sharp. He had one final strategy, one last gambit to win this battle. Zoratha's overconfidence had played into Kane's hands, and now it was time to strike. With a powerful jump, Kane closed the distance between them once more, this time diving beneath Zoratha's massive arm. His target, the weak point on the warlord's chest where the armor had already been cracked. Kane's fist collided with the exposed area with brutal force, and for a moment the world seemed to pause. Zoratha's entire body shuddered, his mandibles clicking in a sound of agony. The warlord staggered back, his chest heaving as Kane stood before him, his hands still clenched in a fist. The impact had been perfect. The Xyloriai's chest plate had cracked under the force of the blow, and Kane's strike had pierced deeper than he had ever hoped. Zoratha's eyes widened with shock, disbelief flashing across his features. His hand instinctively went to his chest, trying to steady himself as he fought to remain standing. For the first time in this battle, Kane saw the warlord's confidence falter. Zorath was still strong, still dangerous, but the human had finally cracked his defenses. Kane's heart raced, but he knew that this was his moment. It was now or never. "Your arrogance has led you to this moment," Kane said, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside him. Zorath, the mighty warlord who had once thought of humanity as nothing more than an insect to be crushed, stood before him, wounded but still dangerous. But Kane could see it now, the cracks in his armor, both literal and figurative. It was time to finish this. Zorath staggered back, his massive form unsteady for the first time since the battle began. His clawed hand pressed against the cracked plate of his chest, where Kane's punch had pierced his armor. The warlord's normally unshakable demeanor was fractured, his eyes flickering with a rare vulnerability. Kane stood tall before him, bloodied, bruised, but resolute. His breathing was ragged, his body aching with each movement. His mind was sharp, though, and every second that ticked by felt like an eternity. He could feel the warlord's rage building, that signature arrogance bubbling back to the surface. But there was something else in Zoratha's posture now, a crack in the invincibility that had made him legendary across the galaxy. "You," Zorath grunted, his voice laced with disbelief. "You have done the impossible. You have wounded me." He looked down at the crack in his armor, his claws now gently probing the injured area. The sound of his mandibles clicking with frustration was almost like a warning bell in the quiet air. Kane's eyes never left the warlord's face. The moment of weakness wasn't much, but it was enough. The human knew that if he hesitated now, the warlord would recover and his chance would be gone. There was no room for error. "You've underestimated me from the start, Zorith," Cain said, his voice still steady despite the exhaustion threatening to overcome him. His fists were clenched and every muscle in his body screamed in protest, but his resolve was unyielding. "I'm not like the others. I don't quit. And I'm not done yet." The Xylorii warlord's mandibles clicked loudly, his lips curling into a snarl. "Foolish human," Zorith hissed, his eyes flashing with renewed fury. "You think you have won? This is far from over. I am the one who has crushed civilizations. I have faced greater warriors than you and they all fell before me. You will fall too." Zorith's voice reverberated through the battlefield, carrying the weight of centuries of domination. His words were filled with the arrogance of someone who had never faced a true challenge, until now. Cain knew that the warlord wasn't finished. But neither was he. The two stood in a tense standoff, the silence thick with the anticipation of the final clash. Cain's body was battered, his energy reserves nearly depleted. His vision was starting to blur, and the wound on his shoulder burned with every breath. But he was not about to let Zorith regain the upper hand. Not when he was so close to victory. The warlord snarled and swung his clawed arm in a wide arc, aiming for Cain's head. The strike was fast, too fast. Cain's eyes widened, but his body moved on instinct. He ducked beneath the blow, the razor-sharp claws missing him by mere inches. He could feel the air rushing past his face as the claws whistled through the air. But the movement wasn't enough. Zorith's follow-up strike came in the form of a crushing fist aimed at Cain's chest. Cain had no choice. He dove forward. As the warlord's fist slammed down, Cain rolled beneath it, his body narrowly avoiding the full force of the blow. The shockwave from Zorith's fist left the ground trembling, but Cain was already in motion, springing back to his feet. The warlord's eyes followed him, and Cain could see the fury building in the alien's expression. Zorith had underestimated the human's agility and resilience, and now that mistake was proving costly. Cain wasn't done yet, he would not be the one to fall. Cain's next move came in a blur of motion. He darted to the side, causing Zorith's massive claws to miss once again. This time he didn't waste time evading. With a quick shift, he launched himself toward the warlord's exposed flank. His fist collided with the crack in Zorith's armor, right where the blow had landed earlier. The force of the punch sent a sharp jolt through Cain's arm, but the pain was nothing compared to the satisfaction of seeing the warlord stagger again. Zorith roared in fury, his mandibles snapping with rage as he lashed out with his claws, slashing at the air. But this time Cain was ready. He ducked, spun, and with the last of his strength, he drove his foot into the lower part of Zorith's chest plate, just beneath the crack. The force of the impact made Zorith grunt in pain, his armor giving way with a sharp crunch. Cain felt the moment of triumph slip through his fingers as the warlord's colossal hand shot out like lightning, grabbing him by the throat. Zorith's grip tightened, lifting him off the ground as though he were a child. Cain's breath was cut off as the warlord squeezed, his eyes blazing with fury. "You are nothing," Zorith hissed, his voice full of contempt. "Your kind was never meant to stand against us." The pressure in Cain's neck was suffocating, his vision fading as the blood flow was cut off. His legs kicked helplessly in the air, and for a fleeting moment he thought this might be the end. But Cain refused to die like this. His mind raced through memories, his family, his people, his colony, all of them counting on him. He had made a promise to protect them and he would keep it. With every ounce of strength left in him, Cain clenched his fists. The warlord was too powerful, too strong to defeat head-on, but Cain had learned the truth of battle long ago. It wasn't always the most powerful who won. It was the one who adapted, who outsmarted the opponent, and who found a way to turn the fight in their favor. He reached for his belt, his fingers numb from the lack of oxygen. His fingers brushed against the hidden blade there, the last tool in his arsenal. He had carried it with him for this very moment. It was a short blade, designed for close combat, a tool he'd learned to wield with deadly precision. Now it was his last hope. With one final surge of energy, Cain gripped the blade tightly and twisted his body, stabbing the weapon into the base of Zorith's clawed wrist. The sharp edge sank deep into the warlord's flesh, and Zorith howled in agony, loosening his grip just long enough for Cain to drop to the ground, gasping for air. Cain barely had time to react as Zorith stumbled back, clutching at the gaping wound in his wrist. The warlord's eyes flashed with pure rage, but for the first time, there was hesitation in his movements. The pain from the injury had taken him by surprise. Cain's attack had not only wounded him physically but shaken the warlord's overwhelming confidence. Now, we end this, Cain rasped, each word coming out in strained breaths. Zoratha's mandibles clicked together in fury. His gaze was wild, desperate. The warlord had underestimated Cain, but now there was no room for doubt. This was a battle of wills, and the human had already shown that he was not ready to give up. Cain's resolve was unbreakable. The warlord's eyes narrowed, and with a savage roar he surged forward. But Cain was ready. He had made his decision. It was time to end the fight. Cain's muscles screamed as he surged forward, propelled by the last reserves of his strength. His vision was blurry from exhaustion and blood loss, but his focus was sharper than ever. Zorath, the mighty Xylorii warlord, had made a fatal mistake. The immense strength and power that had served him so well throughout the galaxy had become his weakness. Cain had learned his every move, his every weakness, and now he had the chance to end it all. Zorath roared in fury as he lunged toward Cain, his claws slashing through the air with terrifying speed. But Cain, despite his fatigue, was faster. He darted to the side, using the momentum of the warlord's own attack against him. As Zoratha's claws raked through the air, Cain sprang forward, diving beneath the warlord's outstretched arm. With a grunt, Cain twisted his body, his legs kicking out in a powerful, sweeping motion. He felt the crackle of energy around him as he spun, the air rushing past his face. In a blur of motion, Cain's foot connected with Zoratha's exposed side, the weak point beneath the shattered chest plate. The impact was brutal. Zoratha's massive body shuddered as the blow landed, his enormous frame crumpling just slightly. Cain pressed on, seizing the moment. The warlord stumbled, momentarily dazed by the strike. Cain could see the confusion and rage flickering in Zoratha's eyes. The Xylorii warrior had always relied on his strength to dominate his opponents, but Cain had stripped away that advantage piece by piece. The warlord had underestimated the sheer persistence of a human. Zoratha's mandibles snapped in fury, but his response was slower now, more sluggish. His massive claws lashed out, but this time Cain was ready. He ducked beneath the wild swipe, his feet propelling him in a fluid motion that brought him right behind the warlord. Zoratha's confusion turned to pure rage as he swung around, trying to catch Cain with a backhanded swipe. But Cain was already gone, moving with lightning speed to his left. He saw the warlord's claws flash past him, missing by mere inches. Cain's instincts were sharp, and he knew that the time to act was now. The human dove forward, rolling beneath Zoratha's massive form, narrowly avoiding another fatal blow. His hand reached for the weapon tucked at his waist, the short blade he had used to wound Zorath earlier. His grip tightened around the hilt as he swung it upward, feeling the weight of it in his hand. With a roar of defiance, Cain lunged for the exposed portion of Zoratha's chest, plunging the blade into the gap between the warlord's cracked armor. The tip of the blade met its mark with sickening precision, slicing through the weakened armor and cutting deep into the flesh beneath. Cain's heart raced as he felt the blade sink deeper, hearing Zoratha's roar of pain as the warlord staggered back, clutching at the wound with one massive clawed hand. "No!" Zorath screamed, his voice filled with disbelief and fury. The mighty warlord had never expected to be brought down by a single human. His enormous body trembled with the shock of the blow. Blood oozed from the wound, staining his once pristine armor. Cain withdrew the blade quickly, standing firm as he watched the warlord stagger. Zoratha's huge form wavered, his vision growing more unfocused as the reality of his injury set in. For the first time in the battle, the once dominant Zorath looked vulnerable. His chest heaved as he fought to stay upright, but the weight of his injuries was too much. The wound Cain had inflicted was deep, and the warlord's breathing was labored and uneven. "You," Zorath muttered, his voice barely audible. "You cannot defeat me?" Cain stood there, chest heaving, sweat streaming down his face. He was on the brink of collapse, but he could see it now. Zorath was no longer the unstoppable force he had once been. He had been chipped away, piece by piece, until all that was left was a wounded giant. "I already have," Cain said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion. "The galaxy won't tremble at the mention of your name anymore." Zoratha's eyes flashed with pure hatred as he attempted to raise his claws for one final strike, but his movements were sluggish, too slow to pose any real threat. The warlord was a giant with a broken heart, unable to muster the strength to fight back. With a swift motion, Cain closed the distance between them. He used every ounce of his remaining energy, leaping forward and driving the blade into Zoratha's side, where the armor had already been cracked. This time there was no hesitation, no second guess. Cain's attack was decisive. Zoratha's massive body trembled one last time as the blade tore through the warlord's flesh. With a final agonized scream, Zorith crumpled to the ground, his enormous form falling with a resounding thud. The ground shook beneath him as the once feared warrior collapsed, defeated at the hands of a human. Cain stood over him, breathing heavily, his body trembling with exhaustion and pain. His chest rose and fell, his vision spinning. He had done it. Against all odds, he had brought down the most feared warlord the galaxy had ever known. The mighty Zorith, who had once believed himself invincible, was now nothing more than a fallen giant. For a long moment, the battlefield was silent, the only sound the distant hum of the colony's defense systems. Cain's victory felt hollow, the weight of the battle settling in his bones. But in the stillness there was something else, a deep, resonating feeling of triumph. He had saved his people. He had proven that humanity could stand toe-to-toe with the greatest threats the galaxy had to offer. Slowly, Cain sank to his knees, the pain from his injuries overwhelming him. His head spun as the adrenaline finally began to wear off. His breath was ragged, and he could feel the darkness creeping at the edges of his vision. But he refused to collapse, refused to give in. Not yet. He had a mission. There were still others to fight, others who needed him. And even if he had just defeated a Titan, Cain knew the war was far from over. He was human, fragile but relentless. And that was enough. The Xylorii forces would come to realize the truth. Humanity was not to be underestimated. And Cain had just proven it, in the most unimaginable way. As the sky above him flickered with the light of distant stars, Cain closed his eyes, knowing that for now, he had earned a moment of peace. But tomorrow the fight would continue. The end. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more exciting HFY stories. Your support means the world to us. And make sure to tap the bell icon so you never miss an update. Stay tuned for our next adventure, and until then, keep exploring the stars. See you in the next video.